Well, welcome everybody to the Media Roundtable Special Edition, where we dive deep into the secrets of the craft around audio in service of the Chief Audio Officer. That is that special person whose job it is to make their brand successful through audio advertising. It is a very narrow lane, but as we see it, the Chief Audio Officer really sits at the top of the pyramid in the whole ecosystem as the brands go who sponsor and ultimately fund the whole economy of podcast and audio. We're all kind of downstream from that. And so it's very, very important to be cognizant of what they think. That's what we're here to talk about today. I'm your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road. And today we're going to do a recap of a movement, a very special movement to us, that is podcast movement, Evolutions, which is one of the bigger events you'll see around this industry happening every year. It was right in our backyard here in Los Angeles, lovely and safe downtown LA, where there's never any problems. We did have a wonderful event. There was a lot of, I think, good energy at this one. Spirits were high. I saw more brands and more chief audio officers at this than I normally do. This is an event that kind of started to serve the creators and kind of the long tail of people that really had a vision of what they wanted to build from a programming standpoint in their show. But it's really become a pillar of the marketing industry and, you know, the whole machinery that we're a part of around it. So we're going to break that down for you today, since we were there and you may or may not have. But even if you go, like, I think all of us probably had a different type of podcast movement experience. And so we've got James Ingrassia, head of client services at Oxford Road. Welcome, James. We have Stew Redwine, head of creative services at Oxford Road. And we have Giles Martin, who is head of insights and strategy at Oxford Road, all of which, it's kind of like the blind man discovering the elephant. We don't really know what shape the event really was. We're going to try to gather these perspectives from different angles to see what the shape of the thing really is. So welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick off and just share from my experience what it was like, because I had kind of a bit of a generalist view. You know, one of the things that happened, James Cridland, who's still a wild card about whether or not he's going to make it to this recording. He may actually jump in real time, but he gave the keynote, the opening keynote, and provided a lot of interesting statistics and perspectives on everything that's been moving around and changing. And that was followed by a kind of fireside chat from Jenna Weiss-Berman at Odyssey and Pineapple Street Media, where she sat down with, of course, Amy Poehler, who's been very recently active in the podcast space. Now, why am I bringing that session up? I thought it was really fascinating in their conversation when Jenna kind of asked, why are you doing a podcast, or something to that effect? And Amy Poehler is somebody who, obviously, legendary cast member of SNL. She's been NBC Thursday night prime time. She does movies when she wants to do movies. I think she hosts award shows when she wants to host award shows. Why did she pick podcast, now knowing that she's really been in the pros in all of entertainment? And her perspective was basically that it's the only game in town. It is her preferred type of media. And to see somebody that has the options of being in any type of media they want, choosing podcasts, I think is very validating for where we are at with this channel. It is the greatest canvas for communication that even some of the most successful creators in the world, the most successful people in the world, they choose podcast. And it's the thing that really brought us here. And so whatever we do and throughout this conversation, I think it's always important that we revisit not just what's the latest technical jargony thing that's happening with AI, but also, like, what is podcast and why is it so important? And is it holding on to that value? And I just felt heartened that I think it's really only the beginning. I feel like, you know, as we've been in this business for over a decade, and, you know, some of us have been dabbling in it for, 15 years or more, it's amazing that the question of whether or not podcast is going to be a standalone channel has been settled, and well settled, now that it's projected to hit $3 billion this year in revenue. But the thing that happens now is we have to kind of settle the city. The wild, wild west phase is coming to an end, and now it's really about expansion. It's about development. It's about working out the kinks. And so a lot of those kinks were on display in terms of, things like user interface, in how people engage with a podcast, discover new shows, promote their shows, grow their audience, the way that we can find smarter ways to optimize the commitments that are made to talent before their contracts are put in place. These are things that started to occur to me. I'm going to just keep on with my rant for another minute here, and then we're going to open up the discussion for any feedback you guys have on this section. But I had the good fortune to do 2 panels while I was there. One of them was called A View from the Top, which I was flattered to be put on that list. But I sat down alongside Drew Marcus, who's with Guggenheim, kind of representing the finance side, Jenna Weiss-Berman from Pineapple Street, who I mentioned earlier, Sarah Von Mosel from SiriusXM, and Steve Goldstein with Amplify Media. And so we're kind of looking across the industry, and we're talking about different themes. And so I want to call out some of the things that stood out to me from that. One was Drew Marcus, coming kind of from the finance standpoint. He basically said, look, the future of media is streaming. And he was drawing a parallel between how the streaming companies, their valuations according to their stock values have doubled in the past year. So Spotify is double what it was before. iHeart, on the other hand, has been cut in half. Netflix has doubled. Warner Discovery has been cut in half. So his point was, if you're going to place a bet, put it on streaming. Radio is down 25% in terms of time spent listening in the last 5 years. So even though the reach is still there, things are shifting, things are changing. And that moment where we have critical mass on the digital versions of these channels, we are now in that era. So we're all kind of organizing ourselves accordingly. Some of the other things that were talked about, when somebody creates a show, do they gate it? Do they only play it on SiriusXM? Do they put it in the open ecosystem on iTunes or YouTube and wherever else? Do you hide it behind the iHeartRadio app or any number of publishers' apps? Spotify, who is the really kind of the leader in the space by revenue and several other metrics, they have concluded that time is over. And that was reinforced by SiriusXM and others who basically are just saying, like, look, we're going to go where the audience is. That's where this thing is headed. Another topic that came up a lot was YouTube. And Jenna with Pineapple Street and Odyssey made the case that they've really indicated they're not that serious about podcasts. They have a podcast app. They get rid of the podcast app. They don't take an RSS feed, so you have to come up with different measurement practices. They're looking at it. It was interesting. She was saying they really aren't using it to place their shows, but more leak out clips of their shows, which can simply be a free promotional tool to get people to subscribe through their RSS feeds, kind of keep it all in that cohesive universe. I imagine that people are going to go one of two ways on that, but it's interesting to hear how people are starting to respond in the current climate that we're in. Now, when I got my chance to talk, I think there are really 2 things that I'd like to repeat here. One is, when asked what I'm seeing from the advertiser's perspective, the point I really wanted to make to the room, and this is a room largely full of publishers and salespersons that are in the industry. It's not like it's a room full of creators, and it's really not a CAO heavy lineup. So the message I wanted them to hear is that, all this trouble we hear about, all these rounds of layoffs that are going on across media, and the tightening of the belts and the lowering of the budgets, and the more fiscally conservative approach of seeing investments pay back faster, like with the minimum guarantee situations, things like that. Advertisers are going through the exact same thing on average. They are more concerned with efficiency. They are more concerned with ROI than they have been in some time. We had a pretty robust marketplace where people were able to take long-term risks. But for the industry, my urging is that we really put ourselves in the shoes of the advertiser and don't pretend that they have a magical brand bag of money that they can just bestow upon you and nobody ever has to get held accountable. They are being held accountable as you are being held accountable, and we should recognize that and support that process with each other and be more mindful in the types of advertising products we bring to market to make them a little bit easier to demonstrate that there is an ROI. The second thing, and last piece that I'll bring up from that discussion was AI. Every panel had to talk about AI, and in this particular case, there's a lot of different ways we can talk about it, but my summary point of view is that in the short term, its impact is incremental. It's not significant on our industry, but it's helping make some back office practices a little bit more efficient. But the long term, and we've talked about this on the show a lot before, is that it's going to be transformative in the ability with a two-way speaker and smart home technology being ubiquitous and AI becoming real and useful. The idea that we're going to be able to choose our own adventures a lot more than we can today. So the example I like to use that I imagine is that if I have a 24-minute commute and I don't have 4 hours to listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, I can tell it how much time I've got till I get to my destination, and it will actually retrofit the parts I'm most interested in that episode to fit my commute. I think there's going to be a lot more elasticity in the way that we get to these things when AI really gets into its own. But the biggest caution that I have with AI for our industry is that, it all starts with the first word, artificial. And this is an industry that I think is important to us because there was something authentic that happened here that didn't happen in other types of media, that made it disruptive for radio and the old ways of broadcasting. There's a personal connection and a humanity to it that I think the more corporate we get and the less it's like the Wild West, the further we get away from it. And to hold tightly to those things, because gravity pulls us to the impersonal because it's more efficient, but it loses the life when you run 10 pre-produced ads an hour versus a few that the host does live in the show, continuing to use that as the lead example. So that's my summary of that session. And just succinctly, the second session we had, we were able to have a fireside chat discussion panel with the chief audio officers from both Masterclass and Indeed, Robbie, Giles, and Kezia Koo. And, if I had to summarize one point out of that whole discussion, it goes back to the ROI conversation. And I think Robbie said it beautifully. He was describing how, look, a couple of years ago, we got to take bigger risks on something that might be new and shiny. But he's like, today, don't show me a $200,000 proposal for a tactic that may or may not pencil out for us. Whenever, and I've been on this media sales side and now being on the agency side, I've gotten to see this a lot. Everybody wants all the money now. They want it up front, and they go, hey, look up here on the second story. It's so beautiful up here. Come see the view. It's wonderful. Just jump up here. And the advertiser's going, yeah, but I'm really here down on the ground, and I don't feel safe jumping, 12 feet in the air. Build them a staircase. More publishers, more creators, more sellers need to create more incremental ways for people to get into the platform, onto the channel, and to show efficacy in smaller ways and create kind of prototypes of success before they make the really big bets. And the more we can facilitate that as an industry, the more brands are going to come in and the faster they're going to grow when they get here. So that is my long-winded enough summary of podcast movement from my point of view. Before we start getting other points of view, does anybody here in the group have anything to respond to from that, those items, or something that you might have picked up in some of the sessions I was talking about?
Well, I think you're right on with basically what I'm hearing is where it's going is conversational computing, that we're going to be interacting with our smart speakers, with everything, with these large language models, with what ChatGPT can do, where there's information retrieval, there's natural language understanding, there's contextual understanding of talking to these devices and them being able to manipulate our physical environment with other smart devices. There wasn't enough talk about that when they would ask in the different sessions I was in for predictions of the future. I think you're the only person that even got close to that prospect of that conversational stuff. I think that that's right around the corner.
It's something we've been talking about for a while at Oxford Road, actually, the conversational computing future and how, cognitive architectures are coming in to facilitate those types of real conversations in a way that neural networks couldn't. And it's starting to happen. I think it's really where the AI conversation ultimately is heading. And I agree with you, Stu. I feel like we sort of are getting stuck at a fairly entry level point of the AI conversation, if you will, and not necessarily following it through and really looking at what all the sort of medium term implications are.
Well, and the thought I had during this session, I had this thought. I shared it with James. He's like, save that for the summer, but I'll just say it now. I kept hearing people, talking about AI and then audio, and I was like, okay, fine. So if we take the A and the I out of audio, what's left? It's what you do. Like, forget the AI piece of it, right? Like, it reminds me of this story from the Civil War where the Union was fighting the South, and General Grant came up to his guys. He goes, "You're all talking about Bobby Lee, General Robert E. Lee." He goes, "What Bobby Lee is going to do to you? You're afraid of Bobby Lee, but like Bobby Lee's going to jump over our line." He goes, "You need to stop worrying about what Bobby Lee's going to do to you and have him worry about what you're going to do to him." When it comes to this AI stuff, the people that get the most hung up on it, I'm like, okay, take the AI out of audio. What's left? What you do. What do you do that adds value to this exchange that the AI can't do? And then that leads me back around to where the conversation really is with Oxford Road. That is the authenticity piece. That is the human relationship piece. The AI cannot do that part.
Okay, great perspective, guys. Stu, let's go to you next. I believe this was your first movement, as I understand it. And I'm interested in what was it like for your first time, and what were your observations? What'd you get to learn? Catch us up.
Yeah, I mean, a huge piece of it was personal. That it's like all roads lead away from Oxford Road, but then they lead back. I suppose so many of the people in the space that I see that are the high ups at these other companies, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, you were Oxford Road class of 2014. You're Oxford Road class of 2015. Oxford Road, and people came up to me like, yeah, it's like a rite of passage, if like if you've been through the fires of Oxford Road, then you can do anything. So that part was cool. It felt good to know that we've been busy making the ads work. And so I haven't been to those. I'd say I have a couple big observations. Like, one was like an underlying terror of YouTube, underlying kind of fear of YouTube. And then it's hard for me to not kind of just conclude like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it will eat everything. Of course it will. I mean, look how well financed they are. And then the other thing was like a myopic view, which kind of relates to that. But just your podcast is fine and all, that's cool. Delivering audio via RSS, but it was like, because it's so narrow, and I know it's called podcast movement, and maybe this is ridiculous. Maybe it's that we deal with audio more broadly. It's like, man, are you not seeing the forest for the trees? And that, like, so much of it felt so narrow and so focused on such a small piece. And that piece feels like it has forces that are challenging it, that it's like we need to back out a couple levels and go, hey, you know what if we talked about audio more broadly? What if we talked about, not that you have a podcast, but you have a show, right? What if we loosen it up a little bit, back up a little bit to take a broader view? Because my concern is, if it's just too narrowly set on this one definition of this one way to deliver audio, I don't know how long that distinct expression has left in this world. That's my honest feedback.
Yeah, it's interesting. I observe that, this conference, it's like every other conference, South by Southwest or whatever. It starts for like a really cool constituency about this new buzzy thing. And then all of us suits come in and start talking about monetization and haggling over, distribution and all that. And you can kind of see where the old original spirit and the new corporate version are somewhat at odds with each other, because it was really made for the creators. And I don't know that everybody really knows that shows up. I don't know if they go to the website and go, what's the difference between podcast movement and podcast movement evolutions or whatever, right? So one of the things that I'm starting to think is they may need to split off and become different events. Those that are serving kind of the upstart creators and those that are really working on the business of it. Because there's so much going on at the same time. And yeah, what do you do when streaming is inextricably linked from podcast, and how, where do you draw the lines on this stuff? So I think it's not podcast movement's fault. It's just kind of the cost of growth from nothing. But the lane lines need to get a little more clear, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe Cridland's got something on this. Who, by the way, welcome James Cridland, who keynoted the event, who I got to see in all of his glory and splendor in a is it a 3-piece suit that you were wearing?
It's a 3-piece suit.
Wonderful, yeah. And you just owned the biggest room, and he came before Amy Poehler. And so the fact that you even slum it with us here, James, I'm just beyond grateful. What do you have to say here?
Oh, I thought it was a really positive feeling. It was a really positive event. I felt, that Denver last year was the commercial business, at least, looked as if they were a little bit, like deer stuck in the headlights. They knew that bad things were happening. They weren't quite sure what bad things were happening. They weren't quite sure how bad things were going to go. Weren't quite sure what to expect. Whereas I think now we've gone through some right sizing in the US. We've gone through some understanding of what Apple has given us to work on, as well. And actually, I think we're all much more comfortable in where the future is going in terms of the industry. And so I felt a very positive feeling out of that. I am wearing my Mopod t-shirt this morning because obviously the Mopod story came out while Podcast Movement was going on, which, if you're not familiar with it, they have a product which they haven't been marketing, but which quite a lot of very large people have been using. And that essentially, if you're there, playing a racing game and you need another go on the car, then you can go and subscribe to a podcast, and then Mopod will then give you a new game for your, a new go in your racing game. It seems to me the sort of the unpleasant underbelly of what downloads drives versus.
Do you consider that fraud, James?
Do I consider that fraud? The owner of the company, Mike Whiston, said these are intentional subscriptions. They appear with a list of all kinds of other things, and people are choosing to subscribe to a podcast. I'm not so sure necessarily that that's the case. I mean, he does point out that gamers aren't all 12-year-olds. That most gamers are an average of 35 and have a household income of 70 grand. But even so, not so sure that it's entirely a listener. And Dan Meisner has written a nice blog post since saying you can buy traffic, but you can't buy audience. And I thought that was a nice sort of theory of what the difference is. So it was interesting seeing that, and interesting seeing two things. Firstly, that a lot of the industry was really quite angry when they found out that was going on. And secondly, that as soon as the story broke, the Mopod booth was emptied and they walked away. Literally, it was just an empty shell on Friday.
Retreat.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. So I'm pleased that I managed to get one of the t-shirts, which are quite nice.
Well done.
Prior to them ending up doing that. So that was really interesting. My final sort of thought was,
does that t-shirt count as a download? I just want to know for any podcast.
maybe for them it does. Yeah. So I think the final thing was just you mentioned YouTube there, Stew, and I thought, well, in fact, two final things. Firstly, Stew Redwine is taller than I thought he would be, and secondly, you mentioned YouTube a little while ago, and I think it was interesting having a chat with a guy from YouTube. The feedback that I got from podcasters was very negative about YouTube and what they were doing in this space and everything else. Very clearly, they are listening. Very clearly, they want to be friends with podcast creators, not necessarily friends with podcast publishers, but definitely friends with podcast creators. And they have unveiled all kinds of, all kinds of sort of meetups and things like that. So I think from that point of view, that's interesting. And I think we've had too long in this industry people coming in and going, we're going to ignore you guys. We're just going to do what we think works. And I think being a little bit more collaborative is going to work quite well for them.
Tell me if you've ever heard of these companies: Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. Any of these ringing a bell? You know, I don't just have the privilege of hosting the Media Roundtable, and a privilege it is, but I'm also the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated ad agency specializing in audio. That means podcasts, radio, streaming, every permutation you can think of. If it's sound and it has ads in it, we try to get involved. And what that means is we help great companies worth fighting for, grow using audio. And that includes media buying and planning, analytics, attribution, insights. We have our own proprietary way of dealing with ad copy generation called Audiolytics, where we can actually score ads for their persuasiveness. And then we work with talent to customize those ads to make sure that they are authentic in the way that they're communicated. They communicate that. But audio is our passion here, and we want to lead this industry to new heights, which is why we've been really involved in brand safety and suitability, bringing solutions to market that can simplify the way that brands evaluate shows and incentivize responsible communication. That's why I'm always talking about the civility score, and we are trying to advance products like Seeker into the marketplace that we believe are helping solve some of these problems. Now, if you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get the best in market performance at maximum viable scale, get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and you're strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence and flip us your resume also at oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. Sign up for our weekly newsletter. Even the great James Cridland reads The Influencer, and he is a competitor of sorts as the proprietor of very well-established newsletters in this industry. So just go to oxfordroad.com, sign up. You'll learn everything you need to know. And if you think of it and you like this podcast and what we're doing here, throw us a rating, throw us some comments. And if you don't have anything nice to say, email me at dan@oxfordroad.com. I'll make sure we process the feedback. I want to say two things really quickly. One about Stew's height. Stu and I met in college, and we actually lived in a place where there were four of us sharing an apartment, and all four of us were the exact same height. So we are both the same height. Usually people tell me that I'm shorter than they expected. But yeah, truly I think we're both just normal. So in my own defense, because inadvertently I'm the same as Stu, I think this is what average looks like. Anything you want to add to that, Stu?
Yeah, that is. I think we do come in right at the average height of a male on the planet Earth. And so, if you ever wanted to know what average look like, guys,
look at us.
Just feast your eyes.
Very average.
I don't know how tall you thought. I don't know how tall you thought I'd be.
About 4'4".
Not tall enough to be president, either of us, but tall enough to be very.
I do want to say about
audio.
YouTube as well is that I think you're exactly right. Like that's the real, and that's a good sign of progress of going like, okay, coming to the table as equals, or at least with the respect of going, you've been in this space. How do we make this work? When I hear kind of the last piece, at least my mind here's kind of the last piece is the resolving of how the inventory works on YouTube versus how it works in an RSS feed. And how do we do that? It's like, if the last piece is really just kind of a technological question, and we've got like one of the largest tech companies in the world behind solving that problem, then that's what kind of makes me jump to that conclusion of then, that YouTube will eat all of it.
Well, I think
you go.
well, I think there's a couple of interesting things here. I mean, the key point for me is if you're a podcaster who monetizes via inserting ads into your show, all of that money goes away on YouTube. And so the more and more impressions that you know, by osmosis end up in YouTube, the more of a bad story it is for publishers. And of course, Google and YouTube could figure out a way to insert ads into those shows and take that money for themselves. So like, I mean, if they wanted to really pay attention to this space, I'm sure they could very quickly send seismic shifts, you know, through the little old podcasting universe. So absolutely view it as a threat. And just one other thing that I wanted to add is, it's interesting that this doesn't come up very often in the area of one of Dan's favorite topics, saving the live reads. Yes. Because if shows are monetizing via genuine live reads as part of their audio, then those impressions that get served on YouTube are still part of the overall impression count for the advertiser, and it protects the show's revenue. So it's starting to be potentially an interesting discussion point, not just from the advertiser side and the brand side, but also from the publisher and the rep side too. So I think that I'm surprised we're not hearing more conversation about that, and maybe that's something to look for the rest of the year.
Well, I actually, on a few of the panels that I sat in on, that was one of my notes, is that while Stu said there's general, I believe you said fear of YouTube at the conference, I found it more a little bit like David and Goliath. Like everyone in the conference was like David's, and two people on two different panels basically said, right now, if you're buying Baked In, which we're offering, you're getting the YouTube for essentially free. So might as well keep doing it until they catch on. So it sounds like the podcasting industry knows this massive opportunity for Baked In listeners and revenue on that end. And YouTube keeps trying because they think they solved it. And every single time they come out with something, like they today was the day that they dissolved the Google podcast app, and now it's all on YouTube, but it's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about listening to an RSS feed on YouTube. We're talking about watching a video, and I don't think they quite understand that. And I have a few people who sat in on some of the YouTube panels, and they said that they just don't get it yet, but not to say that they won't get it eventually.
You know, it's interesting. I'm not going to name any names, but I did meet with a publisher who brought up the opportunity of doing a Baked In. Suddenly, their first time I've heard anybody push it independently in a long time. Somebody said, you know, on the YouTube feed, we can bake this in potentially. And what's interesting is with the kind of the download hit with the iOS update that they took, and every network's trying to come up with their own way of deciding, are they increasing their CPMs in real time? Are they giving money back or added value or whatever? Maybe that's a way they can hack their way to bonus impressions to try to bridge the gap of the projected impressions that were stated. But welcome news. And I think for us and for those of us that are in the business trying to find their way to a more authentic integration, anything that is simulcast is suddenly, there's a hack to be had there while it all kind of gets reset. Just to go back to the Mopod thing for a little bit, which is hilarious that you have that t-shirt, James, and before you put it on eBay and sell it for millions of dollars, just know that for our YouTube listeners, they can't see it right now. So you may need to get that logo a little more prominent, or just your screen. But my observation is that I don't think personally, and I wonder how you guys think about this, I wouldn't have a problem if they used that type of method to market the show and introduce it to new future listeners, if they didn't count those downloads in any of their rankings or claims. If they were simply doing it to say, hey, if we can just get more people in the tent to sample it, then it'll all work out later. Like, that's fine, you know, go in health. But the fact that they're doing it to be exploitative, and that they already got tagged on it before, and you know, we did as an industry, and here we go doing it again. Yeah, surprising and a bit of a bummer, but always better if you give the disclaimer up front, right?
No, I think that there's a difference between doing it with a episode complete with ads in it and everything else, and doing the same thing with a trailer. I think trailers are a little bit different. I think if you want to promote a show to as many people as possible, get that trailer out, play that trailer to as many people as possible, because firstly, that trailer won't have any ads in it. And secondly, that trailer is the correct thing to put in front of a new listener to explain what a show is all about. All great podcasts ought to have a trailer. And a quick plug, there is a podcast you can get right now, which is called New Podcast Trailers. And it contains just that, new podcast trailers from all kinds of shows that I write about. I think trailers are a super useful tool for that sort of thing. And I think as soon as you start throwing full episodes in front of people that had no interest in actually having a listen, then I think that that's, you know, a real concern. Mopod are not alone. I've found at least one other company who is doing something similar, and in fact, possibly even worse, if worse is the correct word here.
Do you want to out them here on the Media Roundtable podcast, or do you want to save that for your own publication?
World exclusive.
I have sent them a request for comment, and I'm looking forward to hearing back from them, particularly since one of them, I find it interesting. They have 3 different products out there. One of them they say is an IAB compatible download, which always starts a little bit of a alarm bell. The other 2 specifically talk about downloading audio even if the user doesn't even press the play button, which is, you know, even worse. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to finding out more about that. So they're not alone. And I think the concern really wasn't that Mopod is doing this. The concern really was that very large podcasters, Lemonada Media, Wondery, were using this particular product and were seemingly either happy about using that particular product or were unaware that the product did what we found out that it actually does. So props to Ashley Carman for taking that at Bloomberg, for taking that story and really doing a good dig on that story. She does a good job.
Don't mess with Ashley Carman. Don't mess with her.
One of the things that comes to mind for me is, you know, the ongoing question of, you know, downloads versus listens or impressions. And, you know, we managed to do fairly well with just download data because podcasting is a channel that works very well for our advertisers. And as long as those returns are coming in, you know, there's less demand for real sort of accountability and perhaps the type of transparency and diligence that you might see in traditional media channels. But I mean, James, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the potential implications for getting access to listens, whether there's any conversation around that you're hearing more recently, or perhaps particularly in response to these types of, you know, stories breaking, because ultimately that's what brands want, that's what agencies want. We want to know who's listening and when ads are being consumed. We don't just want to know when shows are being downloaded, and we can let it slide a lot of the time, but this type of thing just really exacerbates the issue and makes the conversation more urgent.
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, actually, if you have a look at the podcast market out there, around 60% is either downloaded by Apple Podcasts, by Spotify, or indeed by YouTube. And on all of those 3 platforms, you have copious amounts of data showing you exactly when people were listening, exactly when they skipped off, exactly when they fast forwarded. And so if you're talking about a baked-in ad, then you can actually use that as a proxy for the entire audience, I think. We've got a ton of data there, which is really helpful. And the difficulty with an open podcast platform, which we have, the difficulty with that is that it is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get every single podcast app out there to put in little tracking things that show that, you know, Giles is still listening, you know, 32 minutes in, and then 33 minutes in, and then 34 minutes in. That's what the BBC does in its app. It's not what open podcast apps do, and I don't think we'll ever get that. But we've got a pretty good proxy in terms of the data from Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And I think once you put all of those 3 together, then that's pretty good news for any advertisers.
James Ingrassia, you were at the movement. How was your movement?
My movement was great. I was talking with a few networks. We had some lunches, some dinners, some happy hours, some escalator meetings. As you,
that's where business happens. The
right,
smoke-filled rooms.
It was actually great. And one consistent theme that I've found, I know we've been talking about YouTube a lot, but it's really just around video and simulcast. I was in one of the 2023 lookbacks where they gave all the stats, and YouTube, same story, that it's one of the highest platforms for consuming podcasts. And one thing that I did hear from several people on panels is that we're not telling you to go make a video of your podcast, only do it if it makes sense. And that's what the big takeaway was from a number of panelists that I saw, was that if your podcast makes sense on audio, keep it audio. If it makes sense for video, put a camera in there. Don't just do it to do it, because then that cheapens the quality of both. And so they basically said that they make content decisions. This was a network talking based on where their audience reacts the most. And sometimes it's video, sometimes it's audio, sometimes it's both. And I did hear that several times, but I do think that was a major theme, was podcast isn't just audio anymore.
It is not just audio. And I think back to Stew's point, we are running into a bit of an identity crisis in trying to figure out how to define it. And how do you even get to agreement on this sort of thing? And who is the council that makes these type of decisions? Is it the IAB defines it, and then we take that as gospel, or does that come from another group? Is it Brian Barletta that's going to tell us? We just go with whatever the trades start picking up. Like, that's how the word podcast got started, was somebody just called it that in an article, and that's what everybody started calling it. I don't know. What do you think it would take to actually start getting standard definitions around some of this stuff?
A miracle.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hey, Giles, you've been in other types of media. I don't know. I'm just a lowly audio spot schlepper. When you look at the digitization of non-audio channels, can you think of how these things, how was the West One in digital video and any of the other proxies that we might have?
Well, I think that's why you have bodies like the IAB, and they come in and they try to bring order out of chaos, and not just measurement, guidelines and specs, but also definitions. And I think, we can continue to look to them in podcasts. I don't think you're likely to get, industry alignment from another source, because they've sort of, even if maybe as a proxy, they're sort of a de facto sort of podcast authority at this point. I mean, maybe there are other industry bodies that I'm not paying as much attention to who might want to stake a claim to that you may be aware of even. But I think that, if it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen that way.
I kind of think that there's a newer group that I'm starting to see do events periodically. It's called the Chief Audio Officer Club.
Yeah, that's an interesting
it's really
one.
brand. So should the people who are asked to pay for this stuff have a seat at the table in divining what we call the things that they're buying, or is the customer never really considered in these things? Does the seller define what it's called, or the buyer when there's confusion? That's a good question for ChatGPT. If only we had a magic machine that could give us such context. With that, we're running so low on time, and I mean, we could have done this as an 8-parter, but don't worry, there will be another conference to cover in a couple of weeks, I'm sure. Giles, what do you
I would just like to add, not so much from any of the panels that I spoke on, but from the Edison presentation. Obviously, the infinite dial is quite a big thing for the audio industry in particular. Obviously, they have content and research on social media and other channels as well. But I think we often use that particular data point about monthly podcast listening as something of a barometer for the industry, and almost a sort of, the data point, if there was going to be one data point for the industry. And it was very interesting to see the latest data from them. I don't know if you remember, but when we went coming out of the pandemic, we had seen that gradual growth in the monthly listening figures, going from, I think, 37, 38 to 41 in 2021. So a nice big pandemic bump. And then for the first time ever, we saw that monthly listening number jump back in 2022 to 38. And last year's Edison results, I think everyone was watching them very, very closely to see, well, is this pullback something that's going to be sustained? And we saw it jump back. It exceeded the 41 from 2021 and got up to 42% of people listening monthly. So it was a sort of net gain, but not a huge one, but at least we were back on track. But this year, that number's jumped to 47%, which is a big, big jump that I think perhaps most of us weren't expecting. And, does mean then that almost half of the population of the United States, 12 plus, has listened to a podcast in the last 12 months. And I think that that's a fantastic stat and, actually bodes well for us getting above 50% next year. So phenomenal for the industry.
Phenomenal for the industry. Unsurprising, but I think it just kind of goes back to maybe some of what I was sharing at the beginning of the show, the inevitability of podcast. We've got a good product here, and yeah, we stub our toes once in a while as we try to, look at downloads and find our bearings in terms of our definitions and standards and practices. But ultimately, you can't change the fact that it's just a beautiful blank canvas that provides so much room for the imagination to exchange information, to have discussions that really can't be had as well in other channels. And this movement is not going to stop. And I'm just grateful that we all get to be a part of it. I'm grateful that you, fine gentlemen, have been able to share this with me. We're sorry for the loss of James Cridland. Just so you know, if you've been listening to James Cridland's voice, he came in a little late and then his computer crashed early. And so we were not able to complete his segment, but he will be back and he is safe. So thank you for tuning in and sharing your time with us. This podcast, if you didn't know, was brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. You can use this canvas not just to talk about how bad the people that disagree with you are, but also to build bridges and to have a conversation with a free and respectful open exchange of ideas. If you're a marketer and that kind of thing, you're into that, you want your values to be reflected through the type of media that you sponsor, we can help you. Reach out to us, Oxford Road. Go to oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Finally, if you like what you're hearing, show us some love with a 5-star review and send us some comments, info@oxfordroad.com. Or if you really want to complain, send it to me directly, dan@oxfordroad.com. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. We've got a great spin-off pod called Ad Infinitum. Stew Redwine hosts it. Stu, do you have a one-sentence tease?
Listen to Ad Infinitum to find out what makes audio ads work and how to make them work better.
Where do you do it?
Anywhere you get your podcasts.
Perfect. Audiolytics approved. Thank you to our guests, James Ingrassia, James Cridland, Giles Martin, Stew Redwine. Thank you for all the other people that worked so hard on this behind the scenes. Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, the team at Podcast One, the people that we forgot to write on the list. And as always, influence responsibly.